Well, welcome back to It's an Inside Job podcast. I'm your host, Jason Lim. Now, this podcast is dedicated to helping you to help yourself and others to become more mentally and emotionally resilient so you can be better at bouncing back from life's inevitable setbacks. Now, on It's an Inside Job, we decode the science and stories of resilience into practical advice, skills, and strategies that you can use to impact your life and those around you. Now, with that said, let's slip into the stream. Well, welcome back to the show, and thanks for joining me for another week. On this podcast, I like to include a diverse range of voices, whether that's from different nations, different cultures, different genders, different walks of life and disciplines. And this week is no different. This week, I would like to invite Marianne Mark Larsen to join me. Marianne has had a long and varied career in the arts. She's been a professional dancer. She's been in theater. She's acted in films and TV series. And in her career, she's learned to understand what acting is, to embody emotions, to get into character. And that collective experience and knowledge helps her in what she does today. For the last 20 years, she's conducted courses and lectures on topics such as how to succeed in communication, the joy of leading different personalities, what it takes to get people to develop, and how to present with impact. And over the last 10 years, she's had the pleasure of training and developing leaders from different countries, cultures, and companies. In this first part of the conversation, Marianne talks about how she helps clients to find the courage and the confidence to connect with themselves, to understand these patterns of behavior that they have and where they come from, and how they get in touch with themselves. Through self-awareness, there comes strength, there comes the fortitude and the tenacity to move forward. And with self-awareness comes self-compassion, to understand that sometimes we do make mistakes, sometimes we have faulty patterns that need to be corrected. And it's coming to terms with ourselves that we are not perfect, that we are constantly a work in progress. Well, I think it's time to move into the conversation. So let's slip into the stream and meet Marianne Mark Larsen. Well, Marianne, welcome to the show. I appreciate your time. I was wondering if we could kick off this conversation by you telling myself, my listeners, who you are and what you're about, what you do.
Okay, thank you for having me. Well, where to start? What do? I do many different things because my way into working with human beings is I don't think it's unique anymore, but it's a bit different because I don't have the academic route towards working with people that a lot of people have, because in my youth, I danced like ballet and modern and jazz, and I lived in New York for 3 years. And then I found out that, no, I don't want to be a dancer. And my mom was so happy. She thought, yes, finally, she's going into business. And I came home to her and I said, I know what I want to be. And she said, what? And I said, I want to be an actress. And I think her hair turned gray at that point. So I studied acting in London for 3 years. And I worked all over different theaters in Norway. I've done films, I've done television series. But in 2000, I started with some other people we had a startup where we started to train people with what we call like the acting tools. So we started with presentation skills. So that's over 20 years ago that I did this. And that was my way in. And actually, I started doing that because I thought I can make money on doing that, so I don't have to do commercials and stuff. So I can say no to the acting jobs that I don't want. And all of a sudden, through the years, it switched. I started becoming more interested actually in human beings and how we work than in acting. I still love acting and I still do it. But that other part of me, kind of the curiosity of what was going on. And it started with, of course, my own journey. I went to a woman who today is one of my dearest friends, Sylvia Burton. And I asked her some question that, I'm doing really fine. I'm really happy. I have a good childhood, blah, 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 blah. But there's a couple of things I don't understand. And from that day on, I started peeling the onion and really getting to know myself and becoming more and more self-aware. And then the courses I did started changing. I started working more with leaders. I started working more on one-to-one. I don't like to call myself a coach, but I do have conversations with people where I train them kind of in communication or becoming more self-aware. So today my life is, it's really funny. I have an 18-year-old, so I'm a mom too. I'm lucky that way. And I do a bit of acting. And I do courses out amongst leadership. I do lectures for, hundreds of people. I have one-to-one conversations. So I do a lot. And I used to ask myself, what am I going to be? What am I going to be when I grow up? And I'm 54, so I should have known by now. But I think I finally realized that Marianne, you're doing what you're supposed to do. Just keep learning. You're doing what you're supposed to do. It's not just one road. You do those different things.
There's so much there to pick apart. So where to begin? At the top of this conversation, you talked about your curiosity about human beings.
Yes.
And that's part of your process or your evolution, over the last, 20 years or longer, has been to become more self-aware. Let's begin with sort of curiosity of human beings. How would you articulate that? Could you kind of dive into that when you say the curiosity of human beings? What are you curious about specifically?
Well, it started with a couple of simple questions where I didn't understand why I reacted the way I did or why I didn't do what I wanted to do. And how this all came about. And getting to understand how we work. And I find this really interesting because we human beings, we spend so much money at figuring out what to eat, how to train. And we buy, really expensive computers and we learn how they work. But very few of us actually questions, how do I work? How does human beings work? Why do we have feelings? Why do they show up? What am I supposed to do with them? And we see now a society with more and more people having angst. And they're younger and younger, having a lot of angst and depression. And because we're not supposed to feel the bad feelings, we call them positive and negative feelings. Of course, no one wants the negative feelings because we don't understand why they're there and what they're there to teach us. It's not easy work. I think it's been sold out there that think positive or take this course over the weekend and you'll be happy. I don't believe that. I don't believe in quick fixes because I know how hard I had to work at this. And I know how hard the people that I work with work at this. And if it had been easy, everyone would be happy. But most people aren't because we're suppressing so much of ourselves. Yeah.
I think that's a very salient point because, happiness is completely situational. I think what have you, mass media or whatever, we've been sold, at least in the West, you can see this, especially in North America, and this is also indicative of Europe, where it's, happiness is the goal. But happiness is just one emotional state. And I agree with you. We talk about negative and positive emotions. But from my background in clinical cognitive psychology and background in neuroscience, emotions are important. And I think what you said is very important. But as I've spoken on this podcast and other episodes, emotions, the way I characterize it, is neither positive or negative. You have the spectrum of emotions, and emotions themselves are chemical messengers from the physiology to the psychology and vice versa. And it's just to communicate a feeling for us to acknowledge what's going on in the environment. It's a sort of a red flag, both good, if it could be exuberance or success, or it could be danger or hazards, or as you said, angst or anxiety. But I think that's just what it is. It's not a directive for us to follow. It's just information that emotions process. Okay, this is the information coming in. I feel frustrated or scared. What do I want to do with it? So I completely agree. And I don't think it's an easy process. No. When I used to work with trauma, I'm aging myself like over 20 years ago. When you're trying to figure out what is making someone tick or what's preventing them to move forward, from my experience, is that it's trying to say, okay, what's behind that door? The door is locked, the lights are out, and the only way you can see through that door is under the crack of the door. And you're trying to figure out what's there, but it takes time to fish out the as you said, the curiosity, to find that curiosity, to understand what makes a human being tick. And so I completely concur with what's your perception of things. You said you were also on a journey in this curiosity of finding out what human beings are. You kind of turned the light in onto yourself, it sounds like, and to become more self-aware, to understand why you think a certain way or why you feel a certain way or why you reacted in a certain way. This self-awareness journey, where did it begin? I mean, what triggered you to turn the conscious light on yourself? Yeah.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I started doing courses with a psychologist, working with organization, and I started to learn from her, and I started to hear when she was doing her bit, I was doing my communication, body language, voice thing. And when she talked and when she kind of interacted with the participants, I started to kind of hear new things that I hadn't heard or read about before. And that kind of got me curious, and that kind of led me to a path. And in the beginning, I kind of copied a bit what she said because it sounded cool and I kind of understood it. But, after some time, I figured and I realized that I cannot reach deeper into another human being that I've reached into myself. So I stopped kind of using her images and the way she was talking about it and finding my own way of living it and feeling it and getting to really understand and feel and, as I said, live what I was talking about. Because, you cannot reach deeper into another human being that you reached into yourself. I cannot create more security for another person that I have in myself or awareness. Then it just becomes words and it will never help anyone. Yeah, no, it's hard work because you have to be really, really honest with yourself. And I don't think I would have been able to do without Sylvia, my now friend, because you need someone who's quite honest and really put up that mirror to what you're doing and saying and helping you get in touch with not just the cognitive thing of it, but the emotions behind it. Because all the traumas that's there. And I think one of the biggest realizations I had was that I don't have to be abused or had family that was really mean or be thrown out on the street or being hit to have trauma. We all have small and bigger traumas in our lives, and those emotion pops up when we are in a situation that kind of reminds us of the danger that we experienced when we were small. So it can be really daily stuff. I mean, I have an 18-year-old, and she told me, Mom, when you said that to me, that really hurt me. It made me feel ashamed of myself. And it was such a shock for me to realize that on even conversations when I thought I was the perfect mom, I work with communication, I work with people, I really shamed my daughter. So, because, we're different human beings. And to really understand that, because most people come to me and they say, oh, I had a lot of love. Oh, I had a good childhood. I had the best childhood. And I kind of sense that the person sitting there with a lot of anxiety and comes to me because they have anxiety. And, as you and I know, that comes from when you were small. So I don't know if I'm talking off topic here now, but at the root of it all, most people doesn't know what love is.
I think when you talked about trauma, I mean, if we look at trauma just in sort of general sort of governing terms, I think trauma is anything that huge that kind of hits our lives unexpectedly. The pandemic is thankfully over a year behind us now, but I mean, that traumatized families, society, nations. I mean, the world pretty much, with lockdowns and shutdowns. So trauma doesn't have to come through something violent or some sort of abuse. I agree with you. It can come through something. Most people didn't see this level of national trauma hitting us. And the question is, how do you react to it? And how do you find resilience and how do you face adversity? And I think, as you said, sometimes we don't see these tripwires. You said something to your daughter. You probably came from a good place, but she took it in a different way. And it's like, well, okay, I didn't see that. And so that you can trigger shame or what have you. But I think that's kind of very interesting. As you said, you learn from the psychologist what she was saying, you used her terminology, but over time you found your own way to reflect on that sort of internal work, and you found your own terminology. And I think that's very important, because then you show up with your clients in a more genuine state, because it's based upon not book knowledge or someone else. You've characterized it in your own language. Yeah. Marianne, that's what I'd see as, because I went through your website and I saw a lot of the testimonials, and they were from the heart. People were talking truly and genuinely about your services and what they've gained from just interacting with you or hiring you as a professional sparring partner or coach. Can you talk a little more about your work currently and what you're doing?
Sure. On the one-to-one conversations, most of the work I do is to get, first of all, people to connect with themselves, to connect with their bodies, because most of us, we live in our heads. And when we live in our heads, we tend to do the same thing over and over again. Because, as you know, the fear or the ego is mostly concerned keeping you safe. So it doesn't like you to challenge yourself. It doesn't like you to do different things that you used to, because then they're afraid you're going to die or make a fool of yourself. And I see that one of the things that people are most afraid of in our society today is not lions or big animals or those kind of things that used to when bodies were made, But what we are the most afraid of today is what other people think of us. And what happens when people are more concerned with other things, they lose contact with themselves. They lose contact with their own drive and their own passion and their own joy and their own creativity, because they keep on kind of forming themselves into this kind of persona that gets attention, praise, like, thumbs up, love out there. And so a lot of the people come to me is just trying to reconnect with their bodies and their own emotions so they can start feeling what they're feeling, so that they can start making better choices for themselves. And then it's to start layering up, peeling the onion, trying to show, why do you behave this way? Why are you scared of this? Why do you don't want to do what you want to do? Why do you end up in the same kind of relationships? And also, I think one of the biggest things that was a really turning point in my own life, I tried to find it today, actually, but I couldn't find it, because years back, I wrote a contract with myself.
Okay.
Where I wrote down, okay, I'm done. Because I did the work, but not 100% kind of. So at one point, I was like sick. I'm like, I'm done. So I wrote down from today on, and the date and the time, I wrote down from today on, I take 100% responsibility for myself.
I like that.
And that was a turning point, because a lot of us, we blame the world, we blame our family, we blame our economy, we blame where we live or a neighbor or a dog, So that's the other thing that we also work a lot with, to giving people the power back to be responsible for themselves. Because then you actually get the power. You lose power by blaming everybody else.
Agreed. I see a lot of parallels in what I do and what you do. I mean, we come from two different disciplines, two different worlds or schoolings, but I see there is a parallels in what we do. Talking about how other people, it's not lions or things, at least in the developed world, we don't have these concerns all the time. No. And so I see these sort of psychosocial emotional threats, and a lot of it has to do with the interactions of the relationships we have with family, friends, or colleagues. And I think it's just that we get so wrapped up in our heads that we sort of disconnect from the physiology or the body. And I think part of that is for people to understand, because it can drive overthinking, rumination per se. And in that overthinking, you can see there's a fear of conflict. There's a fear of imposter syndrome. It shows up in 5, 6 different types of scenarios that I work with. I mean, there's multiple of these scenarios, but there's about 5 core. And I see what you're saying, because when people kind of understand what's going on at a physiological, psychological level, or what we can call mental, emotional level, I think that's very important, because this connecting with the emotions, it's something in part of my world, what we call embodied cognition, is understanding that the emotions are signaling. You know, the brain has syntax, it has grammar in which to express, but the body doesn't have a grammar, a language per se, and it comes in these chemical signals.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of what you're doing to help people to explore that and kind of open up that self-awareness. So in this process, you were talking about peeling back the onion. Not to get too deep into your work, but I'm really curious about what you do from your discipline. So how do you peel back what we can consider the first layer? I mean, is it a question? Is it an exercise they go through? Is it a dialogue with you?
Well, it's all those things, actually.
Okay.
It depends where the person is and where I feel we should go. But a lot of the time, it's actually using one of my favorite questions: why? If a person comes to me and says, why do I always end up in this relationship? Or why do these men always come to me, or these women? That's the question. Why? What are you attracting? What do you get out of being in this relationship that you think is good for you? What kind of message do you give yourself that this is good for me to be in this relationship, when you honestly know it's not? And then we start looking backward. What have you been taught about love? What have you been taught and showed that you deserve? Because if you grew up as a young girl and you were taught that you don't deserve the best, and mom and dad doesn't have the best relationship, they don't actually love each other, they're just there because that's what happened and they stayed, you mimic what you see when you're a kid, and also how you were treated. So if you were a young girl who were never kind of taken, you were not taken serious, your needs they weren't met, your boundaries weren't met, you're going to grow up meeting men who kind of feed into that persona that you made in that family when you were a kid. And for a lot of people, that's really painful, because what we do is to kind of undress mom and dad. And people start to realize that, oh my God, my childhood actually has done something to me. Mom and dad did their best. They're not mean. They did the best they could from what they learned from their grandparents, from their parents again. But it can be really, really painful. And it can be a shock to realize that, oh my God, this happened to me. And that did something to me, that I'm, as a grown person now, and I have a lot of people in the 30s sitting down and saying, oh, wow, that's why I chose this. And it's really hard for people. I mean, for you to realize that you worked so hard, you sacrificed so hard to go one certain way in your life, and then you start peeling the onion and you realize that that's not really what I want. And the courage to say, I'm going to stop doing that and I'm going to change my direction in life. That's really, really hard. It needs a lot of courage, and it needs a lot of hard work to do that. So most people don't. Most people come to a certain point where they go, oh, no, that's too messy. That's going to upset my family. What are my friends going to say? Am I going to lose this prestigious job and all this money and do paint? I mean, that's just crazy.
I think it comes back to what you said. You took 100% responsibility, because I think that's the difference between a victim and a victor mindset. The victim, and again, I want to talk in general terms. I know it's very specific to each individual, but in general terms, the victim is just that. They blame society. They blame their parents. They blame. As a child, I get that. If you're a child, yes. But as an adult, it is exactly what you said. It's time to take responsibility. And as you said, those people who are not willing to accept what has happened or how they perceive things or their particular patterns of behavior because of whatever, that falls back into that generality of victim, right?
Yeah.
But I think those people, and I'm sure this speaks to what you're talking about, Marianne, those who embrace that part of themselves that they haven't recognized, or a certain behavior they become the victim, because once you take responsibility, from at least from my experience and what it sounds like what you're saying, then they can move forward. And I think for a lot of people, it can be very difficult. And I agree with you, because it's almost an identity quake, because when you have this self-awareness and you see this part of yourself is not functioning well, it's hard for people to recognize, no, that's not me.
Yes.
But then my question comes then, that kind of talks to me about vulnerability. Maybe this is a segue, because you wrote a short piece on your website, and I think it was well articulated on vulnerability. It was a couple of years ago, but I was wondering, can you speak to that? Why do you think it's so difficult for people to be vulnerable?
That's a good question. I think because we were not taught that we could be vulnerable, and we weren't held when we were vulnerable. So if you were told when you were sad or upset, oh, no, you're fine, nothing to worry about. Or even you chose that yourself. Come on, get up. If that's the kind of reaction you got, that's how you were taught to talk to yourself whenever you felt vulnerable, when you felt, or just even asking for help, or even just admitting you failed at something and you didn't get it or whatever. It's so painful. So if you come from a family where you don't talk about failure, you don't show emotions, then you're going to work your hardest as a grown-up to avoid situations where those emotions comes up, because it's so painful. It's so painful to live in that. In that article, I wrote it, and it was so painful. I was really sobbing loudly for a long time before my body calmed down. And what I realized was that this is so old, Marianne. This is not the situation you're in, because that situation I was in was not that big. But I think for the first time, I let it rip.
Just let go.
I just let it go. I just thought, this situation is not that dangerous, Marianne, and you didn't do such a bad job. You didn't really fuck up that big, but this triggered that old emotion, that old trauma, that I was not allowed to be sad or upset. I was supposed to be strong and I could handle things. That was the mantra at home from my loving mom, saying, oh, Marianne can handle it. She's so strong. So that became kind of my mantra. But at that night in that hotel room, I let it rip, and I let all the emotion, and I felt like I was 3 years old. I felt like I was 3 or 4 years old. And I don't know if I did, but in my mind, it was like, Mom. So what I did was I took a pillow. I was lying in that hotel bed, and I took one of those big hotel pillows, and I held it round, and it was like I was holding my 3-4-year-old, and I was sobbing, and I was comforting myself, saying, this is okay. This is normal, actually, to feel this way. And you're just scared. It's okay. Come on. It's okay. And it took me all night. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is very primal. When we're hurt at such a deep level, or as we perceive it, it is very primal to do that, to roll into a fetal position or to hold on to something. So, I mean, it's normal, because, I grew up in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, and that was Canada, but I don't think it was much different here. But, when something happened, it would be, okay, now it's time to man up. You got to cowboy up, Jason, or my brother, Richard. It's the same thing. You got to cowboy up, man up, and just move on. To some degree, I agree with that. I mean, at some point, you got to move on. You can't keep sort of sobbing and crying. But at the same time, you need to move forward. You need to action things. But it was denying the other part of the things, is processing and recognizing the emotions of what they're communicating. Because to bury them, those emotions just come back so intense.
And they do.
What you're saying was I find it very insightful, because emotions, a lot of people get scared of sort of the darker emotions, if we can call it that. But emotions themselves, as we've talked about already, they're just chemicals. They're just a recipe of chemicals, and they're not dangerous. But I think, working with someone like yourself, people can start to reframe whatever experience they have in a light where they are not the victim, but where they are the victor, where they're not subjectively lost into it, but they're objectively looking at it, right? Or as you said, maybe they see themselves as a child, but as an adult perspective, what would you tell that child? So I completely understand. And all of a sudden, those emotions, they wind down because you've
Yes.
addressed them and they're not so intense. But then from what I understand, what you're saying, Marianne, is also we become in touch with that part of ourselves, and we integrate that identity that's been maybe fragmented. Is that what
Yes.
I understand you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah.
Wow.
You kind of, because you suppress so much of you as a child to fit into your family. So actually, a lot of the work we do is to kind of let that part of you come forward again and be a part of you, to integrate, so you become more you become more whole, the way you were born, the way you're supposed to be, and not the way you were taught that you should be to fit in, right? And also, I think for me, there is a lot of Band-Aid on broken bones out there. There is a lot of quick fix.
Well said.
And before you understand your emotions, understand where they come from, and before you embrace them, they will not calm down. That's my experience. That's how I work. The emotions needs to be understood, where they come from, and they need to be embraced.
As Marianne said, emotions need to be understood, then they can be embraced. And at the end of the day, emotions are these chemical messengers. They are made up of hormones and transmitters and modulators. And there's this different combination, this different recipe, well, we feel in different ways. And as Marianne says, we need to understand what those emotions are trying to communicate to us. The body doesn't have grammar. It doesn't have syntax. All it has is these chemicals that we call feelings, that we call emotions. And if we embrace them, if we understand what the information is trying to communicate to us, then we can make better decisions. We can understand processes that are going on in us. And by understanding and embracing those emotions, well, we process those emotions. They don't get stuck in our central nervous system. We can break through and understand. On the other side, there is a sense of freedom. There is a sense of understanding and moving forward. And so in this second part of the conversation, Marianne talks about the deeper work she does with individuals, helping them to unwrap their stories, to understand what they've learned and why they are afraid of a situation. And it's through that self-awareness, that ability to be vulnerable, to share their story, they not only share it with Marianne, but maybe for the first time they share it with themselves. And through that awareness, they're able to break the pattern and move forward, to find a new way of dealing with a situation that they were once afraid of. And through the deeper work, they find the courage. They become emboldened to embrace that situation and to move forward, to find a stronger version of themselves.
This podcast, we talked about resilience. And I think the way to build resilience is to understand what's in my way. What am I afraid of? What is that fright comes from? Where did I learn that I can't be myself in these kind of rooms? Where did I learn that I shouldn't expect the best? Where did I learn that I'm not worthy unless I'm the best in the class? And these emotions, they get in our way to build that resilience. And I think a lot of us, we learn a lot of mechanism, and I teach them to breathing, calming down your nerves, trying to calm down the amygdala so that it doesn't think that is a line right in front of it.
Yes.
But that's for me, that's level one. And then we need to go down to where does this pattern comes from? Because it's interesting, when I have courses, I see that people are afraid of different things. So it isn't true that it's the same for everyone, because we're different. So if you are afraid of something and I'm not, that tells me that you have a different story than me. So every story is different, and people need to unwrap their own story and understand that when I'm afraid in a situation where there is no lion, but I'm still afraid, it says something about what I've learned when I was a kid. And my story is different from Jason, from yours. So we will be scared in different situations.
So when you're working with teams, I mean, or is this more individual work when you're asking someone to sort of expose themselves, to be vulnerable in that sense, expose themselves, I mean, emotionally, mentally, to what their story is as you've articulated, unwrapping their story? Is this done in team setting, or is this sort of more of an individual?
Well, yeah, in some teams I do that. It depends on the framework. I need to know that I can come back or they can contact me. Again, because if you open up these doors and you start peeling the layers of the onion, I want to be there, or I want to know that they will be taken care of. Because if you open, as you said, the door, you're going to need someone to hold your hand once in a while when you start looking at what's behind that door. And I could not have done it on my own. I needed people around me to help me. So in some teams where that is the framework that I can make sure that the people are safe and taken care of, I do it. And with a lot of leaders, I do it so that they can go into their own teams and start building that kind of trust. Because when I work with leaders, it's all about getting to know yourself so you can know others. It's a lot of
in order to lead others. Yeah,
absolutely.
I agree.
And how to build the teams. You are the role model, and how you treat other people, how you relate to conflicts, how you are specific about your expectations, and all those one-to-one conversations that leaders have. And that's what I do with leaders. I train them in the conversation. I actually act out the employee that they find difficult. So I use my acting skills that way. Love that work. So they can actually train on conversations like that. And I get feedback, and we try out different ways of approaching it, and also try to help them become aware of why those conversations might not have given the results they've hoped for, you know? So in teams, I have to meet the team where they're at and then see how far we can go and keep it safe. I'm not out to throwing people out in the deep end before they're ready. It has to go in the tempo that the people are ready to go.
From a professional perspective, I really like that, because over the years, I mean, I've been working in the corporate environment and not the clinical for the last 20 years, 20 plus years. And sometimes I've been called in to a corporation because someone has taken an individual too deep where they shouldn't have.
Yeah.
And this person's left, I mean, not just vulnerable, but exposed, and they're hurt, and they're lost. And then I've had to come in and to help this person sort of put the pieces together and to make sense of things, right? And I'm really glad to hear that's what you do. You know, you need to understand the setting, you need to understand the dynamics, and obviously your deep experience with these things is to help people along, because some people will hit an obstacle or a dark path in their brain. And if the professional, the facilitator, the psychologist is not adept or skilled enough to help them through that, you're going to leave them in a quivering mess in general terms. Just to rewind back, Marianne, something you said for people to, once they understand, to embrace their emotions, to understand. What I've experienced is that logically, people get what's going on. They see the patterns, but emotionally, they're not aligned where their logic is. And from my experience, to change behavior, it's not only to accept it logically, but emotionally, you have to accept it.
Absolutely.
May I ask, how do you get people to emotionally embrace the new pattern they've seen, or a part of themselves they've seen? I mean, how does that process work in your world?
With a lot of resistance. And I feel them. I know them. I have them too. I'm not done. I'm going to work on this until I die. But the way we do is that I try to, I ask them to be as specific as they can. If they've had any experience this week, you know, from last conversation till now, what's happened? Sure. And they say, my mother said this and this happened. And blah, 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 blah. I said, the emotion you have right now, can you close your eyes and just go down in your body and feel it? And they go, yeah. What does it feel like? Oh, it's like wavy. Okay. Does it have a color? Yeah, it's black. Okay. Wow. Can you sit with this emotion? Can you just sit, and it's sticky, or it's, you know, whatever, just to try to keep them down in their bodies. So that's a practice. And then we sit with that emotion. And I said, can you let that emotion grow? Can you let it fill your whole body? I know it's not comfortable. It's okay. It's not dangerous. I'm here. And they feel that emotion. And then we start talking, what does that emotion tell you? What do you feel actually? Because in the beginning, it's just black and it's painful. But when you actually dare to sit still with it, it will actually talk to you, and you will feel, and a lot of the times is, I feel neglected, or I feel lonely, I feel really scared. What are you scared of? What is the worst thing that can happen right now? Oh, and we talk with the emotion
Mm.
and we start to understand it. And then we give it all the love and acceptance. Actually, hug it. Sometimes I have a pillow in my office and they hold that
Sure. Sure.
because it's something, we do this anyway when we hold ourselves, when we're
Well,
scared
it's
or we
very
need comfort.
tactile, right? It's very
Very
tactile. It's
tactile.
haptic, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And then when that emotion comes down, and sometimes I always ask, how old are you? And some people get very specific. I'm 3. Or someone says 5, 6, 7-ish, I feel like.
Mm.
So we get to know the emotions. And the more you do that, the less afraid you are of them, because they have so much information about your story that really explains to you and help you realize where you are today. And as you said, then you can start changing those patterns and the truths and beliefs you have about yourself and about other people.
I think that's very interesting, because sometimes when I'm working with very technical people, or with a very sort of, they're very sort of analytical, very
Yes.
cerebral.
Yes.
So what I find is that approach, I find, works with a lot of people, but for very analytical, very cerebral people, I find that the neuroscience approaches.
Yeah.
So I say, I literally break down the brain. I break down the particular parts of the brain or particular networks that are going on, and I explain it through the chemical electrical terminology. They get it. And at that point, they emotionally accept it. So it's fascinating how different approaches work with different people, right?
Yeah, you have to find a language. I remember when I started doing this, I never talked about energy. I talked about gut feeling and presence and, so you have to find the words that kind of opens the door into their world, so they feel that connection and they feel like you're talking to them. So I would not do this with a person who's very heady. We would just, talk and figure out things and find a language as you do. And also another thing I'm sure you do too is to find those everyday situations that they're in. The kind of the stress that happens with a deliverance or a tech guy, an IT person trying to talk with a salesperson or production, trying to find those kind of situations where they can recognize the challenges of communicating with other person and what that does to them, and say, how does your body react? How do you react when people are like that? Oh, I get angry, but okay. So then we can start talking about the emotional, but it's all in layers, and people have to be, as I'm sure you're experienced a lot, you cannot drag people faster on their road than they're willing and ready to go. That's just, I've hit myself in the head so many times. I think saying you went too fast. Yeah.
I think, that is very astute, because I think human beings are almost like chemical reactions. A chemical reaction can only move as fast as the slowest component of that chemical reaction, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I agree. Even though you try to act as a catalyst to speed up the process, at some point, someone's sometimes hammering the brakes. You just have to get them to kind of get their foot off the brakes and maybe tap the accelerator a little.
Yeah. And resistance is always fear. So I find what people need to take that foot off the brake is to feel secure, that you see them. They're not stupid. You don't judge them. You still like them. You still see the goodness in them. So finding that space to make this secure enough for them to start slowly daring to try to take their foot off the brake so that they can open up again.
So when you're working with fear or anxiety or angst, as you call it, how do you get people to embrace adversity or to embrace a level of uncertainty?
Always the question is, why are you afraid of this change? What is the worst that can happen? And why are you afraid of that? So and what it always comes down to when I ask this question, so what is the worst thing that can happen? That they don't like me anymore, or that I'm going to fail. Okay, so let's say you fail. What's the worst thing that can happen? And we kind of go down that road, and it always ends up with that I'm going to be alone, or someone going to leave me, because that's the primal fear we human beings are born with. Because we know as a human being, when we're born, if our flock or our family leaves me, I'm dead. I'm not going to survive, So we are a very vulnerable species that way, and we need other people for a really long time to survive.
I think I think that I really like that because, I mean, I think one thing the pandemic taught us, not so much the pandemic, but the isolation, home office, social distancing, all those terms. I mean, the whole reason, Marianne, I started this podcast back in whatever it was, January 2022, was that I saw people experiencing isolation, anxiety, and depression. And I mean, through the roof. I've never seen the numbers. We don't need to get into the numbers, and that's why I wanted to create a free resource, because I don't think everyone always has people like us to kind of help them through this. And that's why I wanted to have this podcast and to bring on your caliber to speak to this. One of the things that are coming up with a lot of people, and I think maybe a lot of young professionals coming into the game, is this imposter syndrome. They've got the credentials, they've got the degrees, they've got the experience, but still they have the self-doubt that someone has made a mistake. I should not be here. And so that drives them to be perfectionist or avoid taking risks. My question to you then is, how do you help people, or what advice would you give to people who are under some strain of imposter syndrome? Maybe not every aspect of their life, but maybe one particular aspect.
I'm going to sound like a broken record. Again, why? Where did this come from? What am I actually afraid of is going to happen? And why do I not feel like I deserve what I've gotten? So say you've gotten a job. What is it in me? And why do I not think I deserve this? And sometimes it's also good to ask, why do I need other people to validate me? Why don't I feel strong enough in myself to know that I deserve this? I might not be perfect, but I'm going to do my best. Why is that hard for me to live like that? At some point, you were taught that you have to be perfect to be validated. And all human beings knows we're not perfect. So we go in trying to show the world that I'm perfect. I got the job. I did a good interview. I showed my best side. I got the job. Now I have to deliver. What if I'm not perfect? And you know you're not perfect. So you're sitting there in your brand new, wonderful office thinking, I'm not perfect. They're going to regret hiring me. And when you are in that mode, when you are in fear mode and not in contact with your body and who you are, you start believing that. And you forget everything you know and everything you have. I have this grown guy, and I told him, I want you to go home, because he's been working in his business. He's really good at his job, but he's a freelancer. So he doesn't have one particular job. He has to go out and get jobs. And he's really good at it. He's gotten prices for the work he's done. And he is now sitting, I don't know if I'm going to get a new job. Should I call them? Should I say it? And I'm like, Jesus, you've been doing this most of your life. What's going on? So I told him, I want you to go home and I want you to write a list about everything you're proud of and what you've done and what you've achieved. And he came back and he had the most wonderful list that almost nothing had to do with his work. It had to do with his son, his breakup with his ex, and how he kind of evolved through that. It was such a beautiful list. And he was a bit in a shock. And I said, do the same with the job. Do and go down and write down what you have accomplished that you are proud of. Not the prices, if you weren't proud of, but what you were proud of. It could be this one part of that project or this part of that project. And for him to kind of go through the motions of doing that, and then we can start talking about how he was raised to see himself, how he never got praised when he was younger, how he was really creative and good at things, but that was not appreciated in his family. That was not seen as a gift or something special. I think peeling the onions is starting to understand that I have an imposter syndrome because there's something in me I don't trust. And why do I don't trust that part of me? And why do I have perfectionism? Is just a way you were taught when you were a kid that this is right and this is wrong. So you have to be right, and then you try to be perfect to be right all the time, because being wrong or failing is just not a topic we talk about in that family.
It is addressing cognitive biases. There are sort of what we call ANTs, automatic negative thoughts, when we're on these states of mind. And one of them is black and white thinking, where we don't see the gray nuances. There's a lot of gray areas between that, but that's what it sounds like you explore. I think with that particular client that you work, when he was able to look back and list all of his accomplishments. I think that's also another cognitive technique between gain and lack. A lot of us are constantly lost in the future of all the things we lack. But sometimes what I do with clients is like, okay, that's true. You still have goals to hit on the horizon, but let's look over your shoulder, right? Let's look over your shoulder, Marianne. See how far you've come. You've from the trailhead through all the hills and valleys that you've crossed and all the accomplishments, because what's behind you is fact. No one can change that. That is fact. That is done and packed away. It's part of your backpack. Everything in front of you, well, that's just speculation. Who knows what's going to go on? And so what I really like what you're saying is that, we can focus on the outcome, but where we can take back control and autonomy and create a sense of certainty is to focus on our effort. Because then we can say, okay, I'm only going to put in 65 effort, or I can jack it up to 100% effort. That's within my sphere of control and influence. And it's not just always what I'm lacking. Yes, you still have to hit that objective, fine. And spend 20% of your time looking up at the horizon to make sure you got the right orientation direction. But 80% of the time, look at what you need to do to get there in the here and now. And if you're losing or you're filled with imposter syndrome or self-doubt, look over your shoulder and see how far you bloody well came up that damn road and all the things that you've accomplished and all the hurdles. Sorry, the hurdles you've jumped over, right?
Yeah.
And so that can, and I understand. Again, we come from two different worlds, but I see a lot of parallels of what you do and I do. We have different terminology, but pretty much the same horse, right? To get over. When you ask why is that, I guess a lot of the times you may hear, I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know. How do you break through that question or that statement?
Yeah, because that's how I started. I didn't know why I was doing certain things and not doing the certain other things that I wanted to. And that's kind of the work starting to unravel. I'm doing a lot of stuff and I'm living a certain way, but I don't know why. That's interesting. So I just lived the pattern by the way I was programmed, if we can say that way. When I was a kid, my mom and dad aren't here anymore, but I'm still living as if mom and dad were still telling me this was the way to live. So understanding yourself is for me the most important thing, because if you don't understand, you can't change anything. You have to know where you are and where you come from to understand where you want to go. But to kind of simplify it a little bit, in my world, you have two choices. That's it. You can live from fear, which is the old pattern, the old way you were taught, and the fear of what's going on, being more concerned from about the future or what other people think. That's fear. That's the habit. Or you can live from love, which be in contact with the love inside of you and be in contact with your heart so that you can make choices that are good for you, not so everybody else will love you, but so you can love yourself. So you can live a full life and live out your passion in the way that's right for you. And actually, it's a very sociable thing to do, because if you live from the heart and with that kind of energy, people around you are going to feel much more comfortable and have a much more joyful day with you. And when you give from love, you don't judge. When you live from love, you don't compare, you don't stress, and you don't think about perfectionism. You try to find the best solutions. You're creative. You can think new thoughts, new ideas. We all, I'm sure you and all the listeners have at one point in life had flow where things happen and they had so much fun. They didn't, they looked at the watch, about 5 hours I've been doing this.
I've been there a few times. Yeah.
And that state, instead of being in the head and worrying and seeing what other people do, compare yourself, make yourself feel small, or making other people feel small so you can feel big, and judging and criticizing. And it's very hard living in fear. We get depressed living in the head and in fear.
I think self-compassion is something that we could all learn to do a little more of, because we're really good at turning that compassion on to our kids, our
Yes.
loved ones, our friends, our colleagues, whoever in our sphere of our lives. But when it comes to turning that compassion on ourselves, that's where the self-critical thoughts and the self-doubt and the negative thoughts, and it's more like self-flagellation where we're whipping ourselves than self-compassion. So I think your work, Marianne, is very, very important. Again, I'm just worried and very respectful of your time. Is there any last advice you would like to leave with my listeners?
Yes, get to know yourself without harshness, with kind and loving curiosity. And a very simple tip: every day, try to connect with your body. Try to feel, if you're just feeling your toes, so that you are in your body, more in your head. But really, getting to know yourself is the greatest gift you can get to yourself. It's not fun, and it's not sexy, and it's messy, and it's painful. But when you get out on the other side, oh my Lord, it's like living. Yeah. It's like living two different lives. Yeah.
If an individual or a team or a leader or organization wanted to get in touch with you for your services, what's the best way they can reach you?
Well, on my ancient website, it's mmlarsen.no, mmlarsen.no. Then all my contacts are there. And
Well, I saw the website. It looks very contemporary, very up to date. So it looks nice and fresh. I like it. It's kind of very clean, very minimalistic with the photos and such, and a nice script. So it is very inviting, folks. So don't be scared.
Thank you, Jason.
Well, Marianne, thank you very much for joining me. I think you've shared so much knowledge and your skills, and you. I could understand why clients are attracted to working with you. You have a very easy personality to work with.
Well, thank you. It's been a joy talking to you. We could be sitting here for hours, Jason.
Well, I'm sure there will be a part 2 to this. I'm sure there'll be a part 2.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Marianne. Have a great day.
You too.
Well, thank you very much, Marianne, for joining me on It's an Inside Job today. It was a great discussion with you. We both come from two completely different disciplines, but a lot of what you do and what I do, there are a lot of parallels. And through those parallels comes a confluence of helping people to deal with their emotions, their habits, and understanding through self-awareness and self-compassion and self-efficacy in order to move forward. And at the end of the day, it's to build that mental and emotional robustness, that resilience. So thank you, Marianne. And for any of you listeners out there looking for a great coach, someone to help you work through patterns of behavior, to break habits and to form new habits for corporate clients, I highly recommend reaching out to Marianne. I will leave all her contact information in the show notes. So thanks once again, Marianne. I really appreciate the time we had today. Well, folks, that brings us to an end of another episode. And as usual, call to action, if you could please rate, subscribe, and recommend this podcast to someone you know. Maybe to 2 friends, maybe to 2 colleagues, and maybe to 2 family members. You'd be helping me a lot to spread the word of this podcast. Well, thanks, folks. Until next week, until the next time we speak, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.